let me get started. Let's look at SQL Scripts deployments and figure out what that means. What I've done here, I've integrated a really fantastic other open source tool which is called DbUp, this is their website. It's an open source GitHub tool, so you can find it on GitHub as well. If you go here, that's the repository, it's been around for quite a while. It's currently in the 4th major version. It's got what can you see? 92 contributors. It's got almost 2,000 stars. MIT license. So this is actually a fairly well-established library. So what does it do? They say it very nicely themselves. It helps you deploy changes to SQL Server databases. It tracks which SQL scripts have run already and runs the change scripts or only change scripts which are needed to get database. And in conjunction with pbi-tools for datasets, that's actually a very nice combo, and basically allows you to deploy SQL Server dependencies and SQL Server artifacts as part of the Power BI dataset deployment. So let's have a look at what we're getting from this. I've got a Contoso dataset here. In fact, for this one, I used the new Contoso dataset generator, which SQLBI came up with. This one, definitely want to mention that here because it's amazing and it's super powerful. Basically allows you to specify a tiny or a massive Contoso dataset, and it will generate a random data for testing. So I've used that one, created a Contoso dataset based on a SQL Server database. So if we look into SSMS, I've got a Azure SQL database here, and if I just zoom in a little bit, we can see that's my database. We've got a few standard tables, which most of us will recognize: customer, orders, product, store. And so that runs in SQL Server, and that's what my model is connected to. And what I want to achieve here, and this is actually a pattern I've been using in production for quite a while. And so pbi-tools now supports exactly that pattern. What I want to achieve is where I've got a SQL data source, I want to be able to actually create views which are specific to my model. And I want to maintain those views as part of my database. Allowing me to basically push as much of data transformation logic upstream as possible, right? The design goal is to have as little as possible in Power Query in M, and to actually move as much as possible in terms of transformation and joins and whatever into SQL Server, which is obviously, first of all, really powerful. And secondly, that's actually the main reasoning from my point of view. It allows for much better collaboration, I would argue, because most data engineers, at least, you know, where I'm coming from, are much more sort of able and capable when it comes to SQL as opposed to M and Power Query. So that's the design goal. What I've got here as part of my dataset repository, I've got a new subfolder, which I'm calling views. And if we go in there and look at customer.sql, we can see there's a select script in here. Allowing me to basically go into SSMS and to open that file and run it and see exactly what's the output here, right? And obviously, this is a very simplified demo. As you can see, there's nothing fancy going on in here, right? So it's basically just a simple mapping. But you can hopefully imagine that in a real world context, you could have some pretty fancy and complex SQL script going on here. And so what I want to achieve is that I can maintain and version and change those views as part of my dataset project. Source control those together, but also deploy them together. And so that's basically what the new SQL Scripts feature does. It allows you to basically maintain a folder, which by convention, I'm just calling views here, which it will read from. It will basically iterate through every single file. It will then feed us through a template to basically convert it into a view. And it will then deploy it before running a refresh on a data set. And in order to ensure that you have a proper versioning story, the other thing that happens is that those views are always deployed into a version schema. So if we're going back into SSMS and look into views, we can actually see down here, I've got a pretty verbose schema. So basically the schema name in this particular case is this. It's prefixed Power BI to basically distinguish that from any other schemas, to say this is sort of Power BI owned. It's got nothing to do with the rest of the database. And here I'm specifying what's the environment. Here Contoso is basically what's the model, and then 100 is a version number. So you can see you can basically maintain multiple instances of that schema within the same database corresponding to different environments, as well as corresponding to different versions of the dataset. They can all live side by side. There's no problem whatsoever. And you can have a very nice automated deployment story here. So that's what we want to achieve. And the way we get there is, if we look into our deployment manifest, there's a new option here. Under options, we've got SQL Scripts now. And inside SQL Scripts, there isn't actually too much going on. So first of all, we're enabling the feature. Secondly, we're specifying the schema we want to use for any deployment. This is a reference to one of our deployment parameters. Then obviously, we've got connection information. So this is basically a connection string broken down into the various connection string key value pairs: server, initial catalog, user ID, password. For password, common pattern, we're getting that from an environment variable. And then we're specifying the path containing all our SQL scripts, and we're even getting an HTML report, which we can maintain as a deployment artifact and actually look at later on in order to see what happened. And so pretty straightforward, as you can see, yet really powerful. So how do we convert the select statements into view? This is where this new subfolder comes in. So there's a new convention with a .pbix proj subfolder at the root of our repository, which allows us to maintain an arbitrary number of additional artifacts or templates or anything else specific to particular deployments. So we've got a SQL script subfolder here, which contains 3 files. Template is the one that's used for any file found in this views folder. So basically, I'm reading my select statement for customer.sql, for instance. I'm then injecting the name from that file in here. So that then generates create view with the schema name and the file name. And script content is then obviously everything that's within the file. And so that's going to create a create view statement, and it will execute it. And in conjunction with this one, which is called after update, and that's basically a life cycle script which will always run by convention at a particular point in the deployment pipeline. So it's called after update, which means once the data set's been updated using the XMLA endpoint, this particular script runs, and what that one does is it will basically find any views currently in the same schema, and it will drop them, which then allows us to actually do a create view afterwards. So that's why we always clean up that schema before deploying any new views. And there's also after refresh in here, which is actually scoped to just one particular environment. So if it were called after refresh.sql, it would always run. Because that's called after refresh.development.sql, it would only run as part of the development environment and not for any others. And so that one does a cleanup of schemas. So for instance, I've got 1.0 out there, and I've just deployed 1.1, right? I don't want to have all sorts of old schemas hanging around in my database. I want to clean them up, but only after I've successfully run a refresh to know that I didn't introduce any problems. So and then the final thing we need is to basically wire this up using some Power Query parameters. So we've got SQL schema here. That's basically a parameter which will have the schema name injected, and then in any other query, for instance this one, we are injecting the server name, the database name, and the schema name before we're actually reading from SQL database. So if we give this one a go, let me actually change, here we go. Let me actually change the schema name so we can see how it's how the versioning works. So currently, this is what I've got as a parameter, and we've seen that one's already deployed, right? So we've got at 100 at the end. If I change this to 110, and then run the deployment for that, it will create the schema. It will then create the views in there. It will deploy the model with a reference to that 1.1 schema. It will run a refresh, and after the refresh, it will then remove the 1.0 schema we've just looked at. This particular database is relatively small, so we can actually look at the whole process end to end. pbi-tools deploy, Contoso, and run. I'm not specifying an environment name here because development is the default environment name. So if you don't specify anything, that's what you'll get. That's what you're going to get. We're getting a bunch of outputs now, and I can basically already go over here to my SSMS view, refresh, and now we can see the refresh hasn't completed yet, so we haven't done the cleanup, but we can see that our 1.1 views have been deployed, and those are the ones against which the dataset refresh is currently happening. All right, it's probably done. Yeah, there we go. So it's done. So let's look through those outputs a little bit, because there's quite a bit going on here. So this is where we started, and got an access token. Then we're making a connection to our Power BI workspace. Then the various Power Query parameters are injected with new values. So for instance, very importantly, the schema name we're using for our SQL views is injected here, because obviously that's referenced in all other Power Query queries. We're then saying any SQL scripts are going to be deployed into this particular schema, and they will come from this particular folder. We're testing our SQL Server connection string, and then the model itself is updated. Let's ignore this for the time being, and that one as well. So what's now happening is the update is complete. So the after update.SQL script is running, and that one will basically drop anything in that schema. Because it's a new schema, there's nothing to be dropped. So this completes relatively quickly. And then we're deploying the report, and then we're actually getting to DbUp doing its thing by iterating through our views folder and deploying every single one of them, ultimately firing a create view statement for each of those 6. And with that in place, we can then do a dataset refresh because we've got all our dependencies. So this is all happening here. We've seen that before. And once we're done, after refresh is running, and that will actually drop all the views from the old schema, the 1.0, and will ultimately drop the schema itself, which means if we go back here and refresh, we can see this is now cleaned up automatically, and we only have the 1.1 in place. Plus, we've got the data set actually refreshed against any of those views.